Welcome to Lesson 1.10, Implementing Third-Party Security. In your Candidate Information Bulletin, we are in the Security and Risk Management domain. We are in Key Area of Knowledge H, which is Contribute to Personnel Security Policies. Our topics include oversight, due diligence, contract provisions, including a non-disclosure agreement, compliance, regulatory requirements, incident notification, and service level agreements. So our third parties include vendors, service providers, business partners, consultants, and contractors. And it's an organizational responsibility to manage and have oversight of them, in particular if they are accessing critical systems or any of our information that needs to be protected. Oversight of third-party activities is an organizational responsibility. And at a very minimum, third-party oversight activities should include due diligence, both initial and ongoing, relates to our act of investigating any third parties that is going to have access to our information or our information systems, whether they are on-premise, off-premise, or cloud-based. We need to ensure that third parties have controls that are commensurate with our policies or standards, or perhaps even stronger based on their particular environment. It's also critical that they understand regulatory compliance requirements. We're going to be looking a little bit later on at some of the due diligence activities that an organization should undertake. In addition, we want to monitor their performance, and we want to have coordinated testing. We need to understand what the incident response and disaster recovery and business continuity plans are for our third party. We need to understand the protocols, and we need to test in concert with each other. Lastly, we need contractual agreements, and we're going to be looking at some of those agreements. So third-party contracts should address information and cybersecurity requirements. And we're using the term cybersecurity here to acknowledge the fact that information may travel between organizations, that what one organization does impacts the other organization. So at a minimum, our third-party contracts should include the following clauses or addendums, or alternately, these could be separate agreements, but they need to be contractual obligations. We should have a non-disclosure clause or a non-disclosure agreement. It says any information that we share with the third party that they are obligated to protect and only use for its intended purposes, and any information they share with us the same. And we'll look a little further at non-disclosure agreements shortly. A regulatory compliance clause. So if an organization is required to comply with any particular regulation, GLBA or HIPAA or FISMA, that needs to be embedded in the contract so that the contracting organization recognizes that regulatory obligation extends to them and that they agree to be in compliance with the regulation. There should also be an incident notification clause, and that incident notification should address protocols, timeframes, even what constitutes an incident, so that there is an issue, we know when and how the third party is going to report that back to the contracting company. And lastly, there should be a service level clause, which relates specifically to performance, and we'll look a little bit closer at service level clauses. So we want to make sure there's non-disclosure, regulatory compliance, incident notification, and service level. So in the non-disclosure agreement, which is a legal contract between two parties, we should be outlining what material, what knowledge, and what information that the parties are going to share with each other for certain purposes, and they want to restrict access to or by other third parties. Now, an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, does create a confidential relationship between the parties. A non-disclosure agreement can be mutual or can restrict the use of material by a single party. So if information is only flowing in one direction, it's restricted to a single party. If information flows in both directions, which is much more common, then it's known as a mutual agreement. Very often an NDA is signed separate from a service contract, and often it's actually signed in the proposal stage so that organizations can share information about each other. Organizations that are required to comply with administrative law, that's also regulatory law, or contractual obligations can be held responsible for the actions of their third parties. There's a really important saying that you can outsource the work, but you can't outsource and choose any of the three, the responsibility, the risk, or the liability. So you can outsource work, but you can't outsource responsibility, risk, or liability. It's really important because if you contract with a third party to provide a service on your behalf, and you have regulatory requirements, whatever that third party does will reflect back on you if they do not follow the regulatory requirements. So contracts should include descriptions of all regulatory requirements or contractual obligations that must be met. Transparency should be required for all incidents that occur at a third party. I can't stress this enough. What you don't want to have is an incident that occurs and the third party never notifies you. Remember that the contracting organization is still responsible for the security and the privacy of the data because you can't outsource the liability. You can't outsource the risk. So at a minimum, contracts should include an agreed-upon definition of a security incident and a data breach. So those are two separate things. A security incident could just be suspicion of an event. A data breach is generally defined as an unauthorized party has access to data or the data has been exposed to unauthorized parties. We should have an incident notification timeframe. Within what time frame does an organization need to be notified, and then what are the subsequent follow-up time frames? What the incident response protocols are, so who is going to contact who and how that's going to happen, and then incident recourse. If there is an incident, is there any recourse? What can we expect from the third party? And lastly, business continuity provisions. So if there is an incident of some sort, in what way can a third party continue to provide service even when they're experiencing an incident? And lastly, we have SLAs, service level agreements. Service level agreements generally have two components. The first component is a description of service, conditions, service provider responsibilities, the client responsibilities, dispute resolution process, and indemnification. And the second part of the SLA is performance benchmarks, so what can we expect for performance, and what the reporting metrics are. So how do we measure those benchmarks, and how do we report those benchmarks? And if those benchmarks aren't met, what is the company's recourse? I can't stress enough the importance of education for your third parties. You don't want to assume that third parties will intuitively understand the organization's security requirements or know how to fill them. So at a minimum, organizations should document and provide information about their security requirements and expectations to their business partners, to their vendors, to their consultants or contractors, even their customers when that's appropriate. But we want to make sure that we're providing them that information and whenever possible that we're taking the opportunity to educate them and perhaps even include them in our awareness programs. So let's do a lesson review. For our third parties, we said that oversight and due diligence are absolutely critical. Due diligence is that act of continual investigation. We discussed non-disclosure agreements that generally happen even before a contract is signed. We talked about contract provisions, including regulatory requirements and incident notification. We took a look at service level agreements and the components of a service level agreement, also known as an SLA, and the fact that education is absolutely essential for our third parties. So we have a really short match the meaning. We only have 3 terms. First term is NDA, the second term is SLA, and the third is due diligence. So take a minute, that's all it should take. Put me on pause, match those 3 up, come on back, and we'll go through them together. Okay, let's take a look at lesson 1.10 terms. We have 3, NDA, SLA, and due diligence. An NDA is a non-disclosure agreement. That could be one way or it could be mutual, but it outlines the terms of what information is being shared, how it can be used, and oftentimes how that information should be destroyed at the termination of the agreement. An SLA is a service level agreement that includes all of the conditions of using the service for both the contracting party and the vendor. It also includes performance benchmarks and reporting metrics. And due diligence is investigation and analysis. So it's that continual investigation and analysis. I hope you got all 3. So let's end this lesson with our CISSP exam tips. Let's remember that companies can outsource work, but not liability. That transparency should be required for incidents that occur at a third party. If a third party has an incident and they have your information, a contracting organization should have full rights to know what's going on. But very often that's not going to happen by default, so we want to make sure that that goes into our contracts and that we obligate our third parties to share that information with us, and that SLAs set performance benchmarks. Remember those 3 things. Thanks a lot for joining me for this lesson, and what we're going to do next is a mid-lesson review.